Fire moved along the ridge in 3 separate points, torches carried by riders who were driving something ahead of them through the dark. Below, past a stand of scrub pine, 70 head of cattle bawled and scattered as the torches pressed closer, hooves drumming faster than any drive should ever go. The ground gave out 11 feet before the animals understood it was gone. Hyun Song heard the sound from her cabin window 2 miles off. Not shots, not thunder, but something lower and longer that did not stop for almost a full minute. By first light, she was already at the rim of Backbone Ridge with a coiled rope over one shoulder, though there was nothing left up there to save. Below, in the wash the ranchers called the cut bank, 41 carcasses lay broken against the rock in shapes cattle were never meant to make. She counted them twice, out loud, in Korean, because the English numbers would not come to her that morning. Somewhere behind her a horse she did not recognize picked its way down the slope, careful of the loose shale, careful of her. Ezra Thorne swung down before his gelding had fully stopped, and did not ask her permission to climb into the wash. He worked in silence for the better part of an hour, checking brands on animals that were not his, before he finally spoke. "These aren't strays that wandered off a bluff, ma'am," he said, turning over a rope-scarred fence post at the canyon's mouth. "Something drove them here on purpose." Haeun did not answer. She was still counting, and she had reached a number she did not want to say out loud twice. Three months earlier, no one in Cedar Fork had called her a rancher at all. Only the Korean widow with the strange little herd said the way people speak of a joke that has gone on a little too long. What happened at Backbone Ridge did not begin on that ridge. It began at the county stockyard, in front of 40 men who had already decided, before she ever opened her mouth, that everything she owned was for sale to whoever wanted it most, and that her answer would not matter either way. Hyun had walked the 2 miles into Cedar Fork before sunrise, leading 6 young steers on a line because the wagon axle had cracked the week before, and there had been no one to fix it but herself. She had done that too, in the end, wedging a strip of green ash under the frame and binding it with wet rawhide until it held. Nobody at the stockyard asked how she had gotten the animals there. Nobody asked much of anything, which was its own kind of answer in a town where every other rancher's arrival was met with a nod, a name, a place saved at the rail. She tied the steers at the far pen, away from the auction block, and waited. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Purdy, with a voice built for shouting over crowds, ran 3 other lots through the block before he so much as glanced her way, and even then it was to ask, not unkindly but not kindly either, whether she was lost. She said she was not lost. She said she had 6 head of good stock and needed feed money before the passes closed for winter. A ripple of laughter moved through the men gathered along the fence, not loud, not aimed at any one thing she had said, just present, the way weather is present. Garrett Voss stood near the front of that crowd with his thumbs hooked in his belt and did not laugh, which somehow made it worse, because when he finally spoke the men went quiet to hear him. "Let the little missus wait her turn," he said, and turned back to his own business as though he had done her a kindness. She waited 2 hours in the cold with the rope in her hand, watching 68 other head of cattle sell before the auctioneer would even walk down to look at hers, and by then half the buyers had already spent what they had come to spend. Ezra Thorne stood at the far edge of the yard the whole time, arms crossed over the top rail, watching the way a man watches weather he has already decided he cannot change. He did not step forward. He did not say a word in her defense. He only watched her count her steers twice before she led them, unsold, back down the frozen road toward home, and something in the set of his jaw suggested he had seen this particular kind of morning play out before, in some other yard, to some other person the town had decided did not need to be helped. Voss caught up with her on the road out of town, riding easy on a tall bay gelding, his voice pitched for friendliness in a way that did not reach his eyes. He told her, as though it were generosity and not arithmetic, that he would take the whole outfit off her hands. Cabin, fence line, the thin scattered herd she had built up head by head, since her husband's heart gave out in the far pasture 2 winters back, for a sum that would not have covered what she had spent on wire alone. He said it slow, the way a man explains something to a child, and he smiled the whole time he said it, an easy, unhurried smile that never once reached the calculation sitting behind his eyes, which was somehow the part she remembered longest, longer even than the words themselves. She told him, in English good enough, that there could be no pretending she had misunderstood him, that the land was not for sale, and neither was anything standing on it. Voss's smile did not change, but something behind it did, a small closing over, like a door easing shut without a sound. "Everybody sells eventually, Mrs. Song," he said. "Question's just whether it's on your terms or somebody else's." He touched his hat to her then, with a courtesy that felt worse than the words had, and rode on ahead toward his own spread, which bordered hers along nearly a mile of fence line she had strung herself, post by post, through 2 summers of blistered hands. She walked the rest of the way alone, refusing the ride he had not actually offered, her boots cracking through skim ice on the wagon ruts. 6 unsold steers trailing behind her, on a rope gone stiff with cold. By the time her cabin came into view, low and dark against the coming dusk, she had already decided she would sell nothing, ask nothing, owe nothing to Cedar Fork or the men who ran it. She did not know, walking those last quarter miles with her breath ghosting white in front of her, that Garrett Voss had already decided her answer would not matter either way, and that the arithmetic he had offered her on the road was only the first and gentlest version of the argument he intended to make. Two weeks after the stockyard, a boy named Cully, who ran errands for half the ranches along Cutbank Road, came by to mend her chicken coop for a nickel and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had seen 3 riders he did not know, walking their horses slow along the ridgeline above her north pasture the evening before, not hunting, not working stock, just looking. Hayun asked him what they had looked like. He said he could not say for certain in the dusk, only that none of them had waved when he raised his hand, which out here was its own kind of strange, since men who had honest business on a ridge generally waved at a boy on a mule. She walked the north fence herself that afternoon, and found nothing wrong with it. No cut wire, no broken post, nothing she could point to and call a warning. Still, she brought the herd in closer to the cabin that evening than she usually did, penning them in the near pasture instead of letting them range toward the ridge. And she checked the gate latch twice before she went inside, running her hand along the wood the way her mother used to run a hand along a door frame at home, checking for what could not be seen. She told herself it was nothing. She had told herself that before, about smaller things, and had usually been right. The cabin was warm that night, the fire built up higher than she could really afford the wood for, and she sat at the table with the ledger book open in front of her, counting what little money remained after the wasted trip to the stockyard, running numbers that would not come out kinder no matter how many times she added them. Outside, the wind had picked up out of the northwest, carrying the smell of frost and something else underneath it she could not name at the time, and would spend the rest of her life being able to name instantly. She banked the fire before bed. She checked the latch on the door out of habit, not fear. She lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind move through the eaves, telling herself that a boy's strange evening on the ridge was nothing more than 3 men looking for lost stock of their own, and she was still telling herself that when the first sound reached her, low under the wind, that did not belong to it. The sound built before it arrived, the way a storm does. And by the time Haeun understood what she was hearing, she was already out the cabin door with no coat, no lamp, only bare feet on frozen ground, and her heart going faster than the sound itself. Torches moved along the ridge above the near pasture, 3 of them, spread wide the way men spread out when they mean to funnel something, rather than simply chase it. Her cattle were already moving, a dark mass shifting and turning against the fence line, and even from that distance, even in the dark, she could hear the particular pitch of animals that had stopped understanding where safe ground was. She ran toward the pasture gate, screaming words in 2 languages that neither the men nor the cattle could hear over the drumming, and she reached the fence in time only to watch the herd break through the north corner, where the wire had somehow impossibly already been cut, funneled by the torches toward the ridge beyond, toward ground. She knew as well as her own hands and had never once, in 3 years, walked at night. She climbed through the gap in the wire without thinking about what the wire had done to her palms and ran up the slope after them, calling names she had given animals. Other people in this valley did not know had names at all, and somewhere ahead of her in the dark, the sound of hooves changed, thinned, scattered, and then, after what felt like both a single second and the whole remainder of her life, stopped. She did not reach the ridge in time to see what happened at its edge. She reached it only in time to hear the silence that came after, a silence with a shape and a weight to it that she would carry, unnamed, for the rest of her days. Standing alone at the top of Backbone Ridge in the cold, with blood drying on her palms from the wire, unable to make herself walk the final few yards to the place where the ground simply was not there anymore. She knew the red heifer by the white blaze on her face before she knew anything else, before she let herself count the rest, and she sat down hard in the cold dirt of the cut bank, with her hand on the animal's still flank, and stayed there long enough that the sky had gone from black to gray to the first thin gold of morning, before she made herself stand up again. She had named that heifer for a pond behind her grandmother's house in Gyeongsang, a small, vain, private joke nobody in Montana would ever have understood even if she had explained it. And she found herself explaining it anyway, out loud, to an animal that could no longer hear her, because the silence of the canyon demanded to be filled with something, and grief was the only thing she had enough of that morning. She moved from carcass to carcass in the gray light, not out of any plan, but because stopping felt like abandoning them twice. And she found the bull calf next, the one that had been born wrong-footed in the spring and had needed her hands at 3 a.m. to correct, the one she had stayed up with for 2 nights running until he found his legs. She had let herself love that calf more than a rancher was supposed to love. An animal meant eventually for market, and she understood, kneeling beside him in the canyon dirt with her palms still raw from the wire, that this was not a loss she could measure only in dollars, no matter how badly she would need to measure it that way in the weeks ahead in order to survive. 41 animals lay broken across the wash in shapes that did not belong to living things, and she counted them the way she had learned to count everything that mattered to her in this country. Carefully, in her own language first, because grief in a second language always arrived a half step behind the feeling itself, and she needed for these few minutes before the rest of the valley woke up and came to look, to feel this fully, in the only words that had ever been entirely hers. Ezra Thorne had ridden out before sunrise for reasons he could not have fully explained even to himself. some restlessness that had kept him awake most of the night. After Cully the errand boy mentioned, in passing, 3 riders on the ridge above the song place that nobody in the valley seemed to recognize. He found her exactly where instinct told him a woman like her would be, at the bottom of the canyon rather than the top of it, working her way through the wreckage of her own herd with a care that had nothing left to gain from it and everything still to give. He did not offer sympathy because he had learned somewhere along the way that sympathy offered too soon to a person mid-grief tended to land like an insult, a suggestion that the grieving should hurry up and feel something more convenient. Instead, he tied his gelding at the canyon mouth and started checking brands methodically, animal by animal, cross-referencing marks against a mental ledger of every herd within 20 miles, because the shape of what had happened here was already forming in his mind, and he did not like the shape at all. 41 head did not wander off a bluff by accident on a night with no storm and a near full moon. 41 head got driven, deliberately, by riders who knew the ground well enough to funnel a herd toward the one blind drop for 3 miles in either direction, and cut wire did not repair itself in the exact spot most convenient for that funneling. He said as much to her, plainly, without softening it, because he had also learned that false comfort insulted a person's intelligence worse than hard truth ever did. Heyoun straightened from beside the calf she had been kneeling over and looked at him for what felt like the first time that morning. Not through him the way the men at the stockyard had looked past her for 2 hours, but directly, taking his measure the way she would take the measure of weather, before deciding whether to trust it. "You believe me," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I believe the ground," Ezra said, nodding down at the churned dirt and rope-burned post at the canyon's mouth. "The ground doesn't lie about what walked on it." What Ezra did not say plainly, not yet, was that 2 of the animals lying dead in the cut bank wore a brand that was not hers at all but his own. A pair of yearlings that had drifted through a gap in the boundary fence sometime in the last month, and taken up grazing on the song side of the line, the way strays always eventually did in unfenced country. And that fact alone gave him a reason to be standing in this canyon that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with plain accounting, which was the only kind of reason he trusted himself to act on, without overthinking it half to death. He told her as much once he had finished checking the brands, laying it out flat and unromantic, the way he laid out everything. 2 of his own stock were dead in her wash, driven off the same ground by the same riders, and whatever dead existed here ran in both directions, not just toward her. Heyoun studied him for a long moment before she answered, trying to decide whether this was another version of the arithmetic Garrett Voss had offered her on the road 2 weeks before, a kindness with a price folded quietly inside it. But there was no smile behind Ezra Thorne's words, no easy courtesy, nothing that asked anything of her, beyond the plain fact of shared loss standing between them in the dirt. She said, finally, that she did not need help she had not asked for. He said, without much apparent concern for whether she wanted to hear it, that he had not offered to help her. He had offered to deal with his own dead stock, and if that happened to put him in the same canyon doing the same work at the same hour, she was welcome to think of it however suited her best. It was not generosity, not exactly, or not only that, but it was enough of an opening that she found herself, an hour later, working alongside him, without either of them having formally agreed to anything. 2 people from opposite ends of a valley's opinion of her, digging in silence while the sun climbed higher over Backbone Ridge and burned the last of the mist off the canyon floor. They worked until well past noon without much talk passing between them, the kind of labor that does not leave room for conversation and does not particularly need it. And it was Ezra who finally stopped, wiped his forearm across his face, and offered her water from his own canteen, without asking first whether she wanted it, simply holding it out the way a person hands over a tool that is obviously needed. She drank, and when she handed it back, she said a single word in Korean, quiet, almost to herself. The kind of small automatic gratitude that slips out in a person's first language before the second one catches up to translate it. Ezra did not ask what it meant. He only nodded, as though the sound of it had told him enough on its own, and went back to work. It was a small thing, smaller than anything either of them would have called meaningful if pressed, but it sat differently in her chest than the polite courtesies Garrett Voss had offered her on the road. Differently than the careful nothing the stockyard crowd had offered her for 2 cold hours. By the time the light began to slant gold and long across the canyon, they had done what could be done that day, and Ezra helped her build a low cairn of stone at the canyon's edge. Not a grave exactly, not for animals, but something that marked the place as remembered rather than simply abandoned. He offered to send 2 of his own hands over the following week to help rebuild the north fence line properly, this time with wire strung heavier than the old. And she accepted before she had fully decided to, surprising herself with how easily the word came. Neither of them said, on the ride back toward their separate homes, as the sky went violet over the ridge, what everyone in Cedar Fork would very shortly be saying instead. Once word reached town that the Thorne foreman had spent the better part of a day in the Songwoman's Canyon and had ridden home in no particular hurry to explain why. A silence between them that felt less like avoidance and more like 2 people quietly agreeing not to name something before it's time. The county Grange Hall filled faster than usual the following Sunday, the kind of crowd that gathers less for the stated purpose of a meeting than for the promise of watching something uncomfortable happen in public. Anne Hayoun understood the moment she stepped through the door that half of Cedar Fork had already decided what story they wanted to hear before anyone had said a single true word. Garrett Voss stood near the front with the easy posture of a man who expected to be listened to. And when the meeting turned, as everyone had known it eventually would, to the matter of the songherd found dead at Backbone Ridge, he was the first to speak, his voice pitched with exactly the right amount of regret to sound like sympathy rather than what it actually was. "Ground gives way sometimes," he said, spreading his hands, "especially with stock that hasn't been managed proper. Nobody's saying it kindly, but a herd needs a firm hand, and begging pardon, that's a hard thing to ask of a widow working alone." A murmur moved through the hall that was not quite agreement, but was not quite disagreement either, the kind of silence that lets a lie stand simply by declining to challenge it. Hayoun opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time since she had arrived in this country, that every prepared word had abandoned her at once, not from lack of courage, but from the particular exhaustion of having to prove, yet again, a thing that should not have required proof. It was Ezra Thorne who stood before she could find her voice again, rising from the back row, where he had been sitting alone, as he generally did at any gathering, larger than 3 people, and the hall went quieter for him than it had for Voss, quieter than Hayoun had ever heard it go for anyone. "I was in that canyon the morning after," he said, plain and unhurried, the way he said everything. "2 of my own strays died the same night, driven the same way, off ground with a near full moon and no storm to blame. That's not a widow managing stock poor. That's somebody's rope work, and I mean to find out whose." He turned then and looked directly at Voss across the crowded hall, and for the first time all morning, Voss did not have an easy answer ready. I mean to help her rebuild what was lost, every head, out of my own herd if it comes to that," Ezra went on, his voice carrying easily to the back corners of the hall without him having to raise it. "And I'd take it as a personal insult if any man here decided that made her less of a rancher instead of more of one for having survived it." The silence that followed had a different texture to it than the one before, less comfortable, less willing to simply absorb whatever was said and move along to the next order of business. Hayon stood very still near the front of the hall, aware of every eye that had turned from Ezra to her and back again, aware that whatever had just happened could not be quietly undone by anyone in the room, least of all Garrett Voss, who had gone a shade paler than his usual weathered red, and was working visibly to arrange his face back into something neutral. He recovered enough to offer a short, dismissive laugh, the kind meant to suggest the whole matter had been overstated, and said something about young men being quick to play the hero for a pretty face, a comment that drew a few uneasy chuckles from the men nearest him, but did not travel far past that row. Ezra did not rise to the bait, did not so much as change his expression, which somehow made the comment land worse for Voss than any sharp reply could have. The meeting moved on eventually to the ordinary business of grain prices and the state of the county road, but something had shifted permanently in the room, a line drawn that had not existed an hour before, and Hayon walked out of the Grange Hall that afternoon into cold sunlight, feeling for the first time since her husband's death that she was not entirely alone in this valley. A feeling immediately followed, close on its heels, by the certainty that Garrett Voss had heard every word Ezra said as a declaration of war rather than a simple statement of fact, and that he was not a man inclined to let a public humiliation of that size pass without some form of answer. Sheriff Del Whitcomb rode out to the Song Place 4 days later, not with any particular urgency, but because Ezra had gone into town twice in a week to press the matter, and a county sheriff could only ignore a persistent rancher's insistence for so long before it started to look like something other than laziness. He was a heavy-set, tired-eyed man who had held the office for 11 years by the simple strategy of upsetting as few people as possible. And he walked the ground at Backbone Ridge with Hayoun and Ezra, both without writing much of anything down, nodding at the cut wire, nodding at the rope-scarred post, nodding at the churned dirt where 41 animals had once stood. "Could have been rustlers passing through," he offered eventually, in the tone of a man who has already decided which explanation will cause him the least trouble going forward. "Could have been a spooked herd that broke wire on its own, and the riders your boy saw were just hands out looking for lost stock." Hayoun told him, as evenly as she could manage, that no herd broke its own wire in the exact place most convenient for driving it toward a cliff, and that 3 riders who did not wave at a boy on a mule were not hands out on an innocent errand. Whitcomb allowed that this was possible, even likely, but pointed out, not unkindly, that possible and likely were not proof, and that a county court needed more than one woman's account, and one rancher's suspicion to move against a man as prominent in the valley as Garrett Voss. The word he did not say, but that hung in the room anyway, was foreign, that her word, on its own, carried less weight in Cedar Fork than the word of nearly anyone else who might have stood where she stood and said what she said. Ezra's jaw tightened at that unspoken word as plainly as if Whitcomb had said it aloud, and he told the sheriff flatly that he intended to keep pressing until somebody with real authority in this county took the matter seriously. Sheriff's convenience or not. Whitcomb only sighed, tipped his hat, and rode back toward town, leaving the two of them standing again at the edge of a wash that the law, for now, seemed content to call an accident. Word of the sheriff's visit reached Cedar Fork within a day, as everything did in a valley this small, and the story that circulated bore only a loose resemblance to what had actually been said at Backbone Ridge. By the time it reached the general store counter, it had become a tale of a foreign widow making wild accusations against a respected rancher on the flimsiest of evidence. Egged on by a young man, everyone agreed had gone soft in the head over a pretty face he barely knew. Heian heard versions of it secondhand from Cully, who reported gossip the way boys that age report anything interesting, without much filter and without much sense of how it might land. She told herself it did not matter what was said at a store counter by men who had not walked the canyon themselves, but the words found their way under her skin regardless, the way unfair words always do, no matter how firmly a person decides not to let them. Ezra, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by his own reputation taking a public dent, which struck her as either genuine indifference or a very well-practiced version of it. And when she asked him outright, sitting on the porch step of her cabin, while his hands strung new wire along the repaired north fence, whether it troubled him to be talked about that way in town, he was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Man spends enough years being talked about wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with him, he said finally, not looking up from the wire in his hands. Eventually, the talking stops meaning much either way. It was the first thing he had said that sounded like it came from somewhere older than this particular trouble, some earlier wound she had not yet been given the shape of, and she filed the sentence away without asking anything further, sensing correctly that it was not yet time to ask, and that whatever lay behind it would come to her, if it came at all, only when he was ready to set it down. It was one of Voss's own hands, a lanky 19-year-old named Amos Tate, who had been hired on the previous spring and had never much taken to the work, who finally cracked the matter open, though not out of any grand courage. Ezra had spent 2 weeks quietly asking questions at the feed store, the blacksmiths, anywhere ranch hands gathered to talk while their horses were seen to, not accusing anyone directly, but simply making it known that he was looking closely at every set of hoofprints and every discarded scrap of gear left near Backbone Ridge the week of the drive. Amos found him alone at the smithy one afternoon, and with the particular nervous honesty of a young man who has been carrying a secret too heavy for his conscience, said that he had lost a length of braided rope out near the ridge some weeks back and had been afraid to say so on account of where he had actually been that night and who he had been riding with. Ezra did not push him, he only waited the way he had learned waiting worked better than pressing, letting the silence do the work that questions rarely managed as well. And Amos, once he had started talking, found it easier to keep going than to stop, the words coming faster now that the first admission had finally been spoken aloud. He named the other 2 riders. He described the running iron Voss kept in a saddlebag separate from his regular branding tools, one that had been sharpened recently for reasons Amos had not questioned at the time, but understood clearly now. He said Voss had told them it was only meant to scare the herd off her land, drive them back toward the boundary fence and make a point, and that none of them had understood until it was already happening in the dark with torches and no way to call the animals back, how close to the cliff the drive was actually heading. Ezra rode straight to the sheriff's office with Amos beside him that same evening before the boy's nerve could fail him again, and laid the braided rope scrap recovered from the ridge fence post beside the description Amos gave of Voss's separate running iron, and for the first time since Backbone Ridge, Sheriff Whitcomb wrote something down. News that Amos Tate had given a sworn statement to the sheriff moved through Cedar Fork faster than any rumor had moved before it, in part because it came with a name attached and a name that mattered. And by the following morning, half the valley seemed to know some version of the truth even before the county judge had been sent for from the seat 2 days' ride south. Howen learned of it from Ezra himself, who rode out early enough that frost still lay thick on the grass to tell her plainly, without embellishment, exactly what Amos had said, and exactly what physical evidence now sat in the sheriff's small office, waiting on a judge's attention. She sat with the news for a long while after he finished speaking, turning it over the way she had turned over the numbers in her ledger book on so many cold nights, and found that it did not bring the relief she might have expected. Knowing who and knowing why did not put the red heifer back in her pasture, did not undo the 2 nights she had spent coaxing a wrong-footed calf onto his legs only to lose him at the bottom of a canyon weeks later. It only meant that the loss finally had a face attached to it, a name, a reason, something to hold responsible instead of the shapeless unfairness she had been carrying alone since that first terrible sound reached her cabin window. "What happens to him now?" she asked, and Ezra told her honestly that he did not entirely know, that county justice out here moved slower and stranger than anyone would like, but that whatever happened, it would happen in daylight, in front of witnesses, with her name spoken as the wronged party rather than the suspect party, for the first time since this whole business had begun. She found, sitting across from him at her own kitchen table with the ledger still open between them, that she believed him, and that the believing itself, after so many weeks of being disbelieved by nearly everyone else in the valley, felt almost as important as whatever justice eventually arrived. The weeks between Amos Tate's confession and the judge's arrival stretched long and strange, full of ordinary ranch work that felt anything but ordinary now that Ezra had taken to riding over most evenings to help with the endless small repairs Backbone Ridge had left behind. A gate that needed rehanging, a smokehouse roof that had gone soft with the last rain, fence line after fence line that needed checking twice now instead of once. They fell, without ever quite deciding to, into the habit of sharing supper afterward. Simple food eaten at her small table while the fire burned down low, and it was during one of those quiet evenings that he asked her, hesitantly, for the actual name of the heifer she had mentioned once without explaining. The one from the pond behind her grandmother's house. She told him the story properly that time, the whole of it, the pond and the grandmother and the particular color the water turned in autumn, and he listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow sympathy that made grief feel smaller instead of honored. In turn, haltingly, he told her a handful of Korean words she taught him for supper, for fire, for thank you, mangling the pronunciation badly enough that she laughed for what felt like the first time in a month, a real laugh that surprised her with how easily it came. These were small things, none of them large enough on their own to call significant, but they accumulated the way frost accumulates on a window, one quiet layer at a time. Until one evening she looked up from the fire and realized she had stopped bracing herself, out of old habit, for the moment he would eventually leave the way everyone eventually left, and understood that some part of her had begun, without permission, to hope he would not. It was Ezra who finally set down the older weight he had been carrying on a night when the wind outside was loud enough to make the fire gutter, and neither of them had much reason to hurry towards sleep. He told her, in the same plain, unhurried way he told her everything, that he had not always been simply a rancher who kept to himself. Years before, in a different county further south, he had ridden with a small outfit as a hired gun for hire in all but name. fast enough with a pistol that men had started using the word before his own name when they spoke of him, and he had used that speed exactly once in a way he could never take back, against a man who had, in fact, deserved far worse than what Ezra gave him, and had still spent every year since wondering whether the world had been made any better for it or only louder. He had watched a woman he cared for then, a rancher's widow not so different in her circumstances from Hyun, get driven off her own land by men who used exactly the kind of fear and rumor Voss had tried to use here, and he had answered that with his gun instead of the law, and had won and had still lost her regardless, because a woman does not easily build a life beside a man the whole county has learned to be afraid of. He had come north after that, and sworn off the gun as anything but a tool for coyotes and rattlesnakes, had built a quiet reputation instead of a fast one, and had told himself for years that he wanted nothing more from any valley than to be left alone in it. "Then your herd went off that ridge," he said, watching the fire rather than her. "And I found out real quick, I hadn't actually stopped caring what happened to people the county decided not to protect. I'd just gotten good at pretending otherwise." Haeyeon reached across the small space between them and set her hand over his, not saying anything at all for a long moment, understanding for the first time the particular shape of the restraint he had shown from the very start. Not indifference and not cowardice, but a hard-won, deliberate choice to answer cruelty with something slower and harder than a bullet, because he had already tried the fast way once and knew exactly what it cost. The county judge arrived on schedule 2 weeks later and heard the matter in the same Grange hall where Ezra had first stood to defend her. And this time the hall filled not for the promise of watching discomfort, but because half the valley had come to see whether justice out here actually worked the way the law books said it should. Amos Tate testified first, pale and shaking but steady in the substance of what he said, and the sworn statement was followed by the recovered rope, the description of the separate running iron, and finally, damningly, the iron itself, produced by the sheriff after a search of Voss's tack room that Voss himself, cornered by the weight of everything already laid before the judge, no longer had the standing to refuse. Garrett Voss did not go to prison that day, because the law in a county this size and this remote rarely reached that far for property crimes against a woman it had spent months deciding not to fully believe. But what happened instead struck Hae-seun as its own kind of justice, slower, but perhaps more lasting. The judge revoked his grazing lease on 2 sections of county land he had held for a decade. The bank in town, hearing the full account read into the record, called due a loan Voss had been carrying against next season's herd, a debt he could not cover without selling off nearly half of what he owned. And the valley itself, the same crowd that had laughed quietly at her expense in the stockyard months before, turned from him with the particular cold finality small communities reserve for a man caught doing exactly the thing he had accused a foreign widow of being too weak to prevent. He left the Grange Hall alone that afternoon, without a single rancher offering him so much as a nod, and Hae-yeon found she felt less triumph in watching it than she had expected. Mostly, instead, a great tiredness, and beneath the tiredness, for the first time in months, something that might have been the beginning of rest. What followed in the days after the hearing was, in its own way, the part Hae-yeon would remember longest, longer even than the hearing itself. Word had spread of the full account, and ranchers from 3 separate spreads along the valley, Men who had stood silent at the stockyard months earlier and said nothing while she waited 2 cold hours to be seen, began arriving at her homestead in 2s and 3s over the following week, each bringing 2 or 3 head of cattle from their own herds, offered plainly and without ceremony as partial repayment for a wrong the whole valley had let stand too long by looking away. Ezra matched their number several times over from his own herd, and by the end of that week her pastures held more cattle than they had held before Backbone Ridge, a fact that struck her as both a kind of grace and a kind of grief she suspected would never fully separate from each other in her memory of that year. The final piece came at the county recorder's office, where Ezra insisted, over her initial protest that she did not need his insistence on anything, that the bill of sale for the new herd be drawn up and registered in her name alone, with a newly registered running iron bearing her own mark rather than her late husband's, something she had not previously had the standing or the funds to arrange on her own, and had simply gone without, letting old paperwork stand in for a legal reality that no longer quite matched her life. The recorder, a fussy, careful man who had never once in 11 years registered a brand to a woman without a husband's name attached, hesitated over the form for a long moment before Ezra, standing beside her with his arms crossed and an expression that invited no further hesitation, asked plainly whether there was some difficulty with the paperwork that needed explaining. There was not, it turned out, any difficulty at all beyond habit, and the recorder signed the document, and for the first time since arriving in this country, every animal grazing on her land belonged to her, on paper, in her own name, in a way that no one, not Garrett Voss, not the stockyard crowd, not the fussy, careful recorder himself, could quietly take away from her again. By the time the first real snow came to Cedar Fork that winter, the pastures around Hayon's cabin held more cattle than they ever had under her husband's original brand, each animal carrying her own new mark burned clean into its hide, and the valley had learned, in the particular slow way small communities learn anything, to call her simply a rancher, without the qualifying words that used to come before it. She still walked into the stockyard some mornings and felt, for a breath, the old bracing tension of a body remembering 2 cold hours at the rail. But the auctioneer greeted her by name now, and the men along the fence made room without being asked, and Garrett Voss, stripped of his grazing lease and half his herd, had sold what remained of his spread to a family from Ohio and left the valley entirely before the first frost, a departure nobody in Cedar Fork seemed inclined to mourn. Ezra's cabin, smaller and plainer than his main ranch house, sat close enough to hers now that he had taken, without much discussion on the subject, to simply being there most evenings, his gelding turned out in her near pasture, alongside the animals whose names he had slowly learned, right along with her. And on the evening the whole valley gathered at her fence line to watch the newly combined herd graze together under a sky gone pink and gold at dusk. He took her hand in front of every rancher who had once refused to look at her directly, and nobody in that crowd so much as blinked at the sight of it, which felt, to both of them, like its own quiet kind of vindication, larger somehow than any courtroom could have provided. Hewn still climbs to the rim of Backbone Ridge sometimes, in the quiet hour just after dawn, and stands where she once stood, counting in a language nobody around her could understand. And the ground there has long since gone green again, with new grass, the way ground in this country always eventually does, patient and indifferent to what was lost on it, carrying no memory of its own, beyond what she chooses to bring back up to the rim with her. She thinks, on those mornings, of the red heifer and the wrong-footed calf, and the 39 others whose names only she had ever known. And she thinks too of everything that grew, unlikely and unplanned, out of that single terrible night. A herd larger than before, a mark on every hide that is entirely her own. A man beside her who chose, over and over in the months that followed, to answer cruelty with patience instead of a faster gun. And a valley that finally, slowly, painfully, learned to say her name the way it should have said it, from the very first morning at the stockyard rail, back when 40 men had let 2 cold hours pass without once offering her the simple decency of being seen. If a story like hers has taught anything worth carrying forward, it is that vindication does not always arrive with thunder or gunfire. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a signed piece of paper, in a hand held without flinching in front of a crowd, in cattle grazing safely on ground that was once made to feel unsafe on purpose. What would you have done, in her place, standing alone at that cliff edge counting what the dark had taken? And how far would you have gone to build it back? Tell me in the comments below which part of Hyun and Ezra's story stayed with you longest. And if you want more Iron Bloom tales like this one, make sure you subscribe, because there are more women like her still waiting to have their stories told. More quiet ridges and quiet valleys that remember exactly what happened on them, even when nobody thought to write it down.